we're going to talk about biological macromolecules. And sometimes you might have heard this, like if you're really into nutrition or exercise, you may have heard the term macros. They're typically referring to these biological macromolecules. Now, what are the biological macromolecules? Well, they can be grouped into 4 basic categories, and 3 of the categories you might be already familiar with. In fact, if you look on the back package of any sort of nutritional or food package, you can find 3 of the categories right there. So the categories of biological macromolecules you should know for this class are carbohydrates, so carbs for short, or sometimes called sugars, but again, there's more than just sugars for carbohydrates. Things like fiber are also carbohydrates as well. Then you have lipids and fat, or sometimes just simply called fats. But lipids is a general term for these group of chemicals that have a lot of carbon-carbon and hydrocarbon bonds. Don't worry, we'll cover that in a short while. And then there are proteins. F in the chat. This is why I prefaced it, because it's been pretty dodgy lately. So this is why I wanted to see that. But hopefully we're back. So stream is back. All right, the last biological macromolecules we're going to talk about are nucleic acids. So nucleic acids, do you see these in the nutrition facts? Well, you don't see them in the nutrition facts because nucleic acids, even though through complex biochemistry they can become metabolized into energy, typically they're not metabolized into energy because you would pretty much have to use up your reserve of all of these 3 before you start burning the nucleic acids in your body. So nucleic acids, not a major energy source. They're still a biological macromolecule. They're just not on your nutrition label because they don't really contribute to your caloric intake and energy intake. Okay. So let's first talk about carbohydrates. Let's talk about that first category. So carbohydrates, well, there are many types of carbohydrates, but what are the ones I want you to know? So the carbohydrates I want you to know are monosaccharides. So monosaccharides refers to 1. And then there are many types of monosaccharides, but these are ones you should definitely know. So things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then you also have disaccharides. So disaccharides means 2. So disaccharides referring to 2 simple sugars in monosaccharides joined together. So examples of that we have here. Now, there are many types of disaccharides, but the lists I'm keeping here, or showing on this screen here, these are the ones you should have. And polysaccharides, poly mean many, and then so you have things like glycogen, starch, and cellulose. Those are examples of polysaccharides. So what about the structures and properties of glucose? So with glucose, what we have are, so here we have glucose, the structure of glucose, and actually, so this isn't an organic chemistry class, so I'm not going to, but often you might see with chemical structures, they just have like sticks and lines, but they don't say exactly what atoms are at these angles. So whenever you see this kind of like stick and line, and you see an angle like this, it's typically, especially when you're talking about biochemistry and cell biology, they're implying that carbon is here. So actually each of these angles here has a carbon atom over there. And also hydrogen atoms as well, but that's a little too organic chemistry. But what am I getting at here? So remember those polar bonds, those polar covalent bonds, and how oxygen bound to hydrogen makes oxygen a little negative and hydrogen a little positive? Well, this is where we have, so think about this, you have all these polar covalent bonds. So with all these partial charges on different atoms of glucose, the water is very attracted to that. Now, glucose overall has no charge. It's not an ion. But it's possible to have an overall molecule that has no charge, but different atoms on it have slight charges due to those polar covalent bonds. Okay, so then we have 2 monosaccharides, we have 2 carbohydrates here. So the cool thing about carbohydrates is that you can take simple carbohydrates and join them together and break them apart. Here we have 2 simple carbohydrates, glucose and fructose, and what happens is that you can do a reaction that joins them together. Now the cool thing is that you notice that we have this oxygen and hydrogen on both of these molecules coming together. but the end product only has one oxygen. So what happens to the rest of the atoms? Well, actually, those two hydrogens and one oxygen comes off of these structures. And hey, what has the chemical structure H2O? Hey, water does, right? So this is what we call a synthesis reaction, dehydration synthesis reaction, because you have water being produced as a result of this reaction coming together. Yep, so this is sucrose, so table sugar, or common sweetener. So table sugar is actually made from two smaller carbohydrates being linked together to form what we call a disaccharide. So sucrose is bigger than glucose, but it's made out of glucose and fructose. Now, there are many types of disaccharides, but these are the ones you definitely should know, especially if you're continuing on to PHYL 142, because there are special enzymes that help to catalyze these reactions. So glucose plus glucose makes a disaccharide we call maltose. So then, over here, glucose plus fructose, as we mentioned in the previous slide, that makes sucrose. And then glucose plus galactose makes a probably familiar sounding carbohydrate called lactose. So a common thing that trips up people think that, oh, galactose, because it has a longer name, is the disaccharide, and lactose is this monosaccharide. Lactose is actually bigger than galactose. So lactose is the disaccharide, galactose is the monosaccharide. And yes, thank you to people in the chat who are helping things with tech support. Again, this is why I go into work, because UH Wi-Fi connections are and Ethernet connections are way better than home connections and Spectrum. Okay, so back to carbohydrates. So we have one single carbohydrate, a monosaccharide here. So that's, again, one is a prefix, that prefix mono means one. And then when you have two monosaccharides joined together, that di prefix, di, refers to two carbohydrates. Now, when you have more monosaccharides linked together to this larger structure, then you have many saccharides. So there's another useful prefix that you see all the time in medical and scientific terminology called poly. So whenever you see something saying poly, that means many. So if you have many carbohydrates, more than two, let's just define it as that, more than two carbohydrates linked together, you have a polysaccharide. There are trisaccharides, but let's just say 3 or more. Yeah, 2 or 3 or more, you have a polysaccharide. So these are polymers. So the cool thing is, like, this term polymer, you may have heard this if you've taken a chemistry class before. But polymers, what you notice is that you have one monosaccharide and you keep on daisy chaining and having this repeating structure. So that's what we have there. So a polymer is a chain of any type of molecule, but you keep on repeating this link and joining them together through chemical bonds, so they form a larger and larger structure. So what we have here is a single person, and this is in the before times. So in the before times, you can hang out together, but what if you had a polymer of people? Well, you would have a repeating structure that has multiple single units in a repeating chain over here. So what we have here with all these people gathering together in the before times is a polymer of people. Okay, so then what we have here is that carbs, so carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleotides, they can form polymers. So many of these biological macromolecules, they can form these repeating structures theoretically until infinite, but again, your cells are finite, so they're not infinite. But they can repeat these structures over and over to go from a simple molecule and then build multiple bonds until you have bigger and bigger molecules. So fatty acids and lipids, these aren't exceptions. They can form complex molecules, but they don't typically form super long, potentially infinite chains of molecules and fatty acids or lipids. Now, what I'm getting at is that these biological macromolecules, they can join together and form bigger, more complex molecules. So an example of this is starch. So starch, here we have a single chain of monosaccharides together. So what you have here is that you have this monosaccharides forming a long chain. So this linear chain of monosaccharides In this case, we're talking about the long chain or single chain of glucose. It's called amylose. And then there's also a branched version of this. So it's not polymers aren't necessarily just linear in a single chain that doesn't branch. Polymers can sometimes also branch. And in the case of amylopectin, is that you can have multiple chains of these carbohydrates branching and extending off into form complex structures. Now, glycogen. So you don't produce starch. Plants produce starch, but glycogen is like the starch of our own bodies. So your body is actually able to take, if say your body has too much glucose flowing around your bloodstream, does it have to just burn up that glucose immediately, or can it store it for later? The great thing about glycogen is that this is a one way your body can store the energy, or actually can store glucose molecules for later on. So things like your liver and your skeletal muscle, they're actually able to hold on to a limited amount of carbohydrates by making glycogen. Now, glycogen, it branches even more than starch, and I know it's not very exact, but that's like a general difference between glycogen and starch. What you have are all of these carbohydrates, all this glucose linked together to form a branch structure. And the cool thing is, like, say you're burning through your energy and you actually want to release more glucose into your bloodstream that you've previously stored up. So the cool thing is that you're actually able to break apart glycogen and release glucose, so you're able to use that energy for later. Okay, so let's do our first question. And yes. So here we have a reaction. Glucose plus glucose are the reactant, and maltose is the product. What terms best describe this reaction? Okay, so what the responses are. So let's see what people said and what's the correct answers. Well, these are the correct answers. So there's more than one possible correct answer, but it is an anabolic reaction. Why? Because you're building a larger structure, and it's also a synthesis reaction because you're synthesizing a larger molecule and bringing molecules together versus breaking them apart.